Hello, my baby gorillas, and I want to talk to you with regards to Friedrich Engels and Marxism, and that the Manchester Labour Party has put up a statue to someone who advocated genocide. I mean, the hypocrisy of hate speech, yet they are putting statues, the Labour Party are putting statues up to people who advocated for genocide. I don't think you could have anybody that's much worse. And Friedrich Engels and Marx were the inspirations for fascism and National Socialism in the future. So people maybe don't understand what Marxism is and where it's come from and what the significance of putting up a statue to this individual is. So, and there's a lot of people in Scotland that follow Marxism as well. I think the Nicola Sturgeon being somebody who supports intersectional politics. Intersectional politics is just based around the teachings of Marx and Engels as well, and so I don't know. We'll discuss Nicola Sturgeon in a minute. But certainly here they put a statue up. I mean, to have a communist statue, I don't know if they would put up a Nazi statue to Hitler as well. I don't know if that's on the cards for the Manchester Labour Party as well, or is only left-wing murderous dictators that they find acceptable. I'm not quite sure. Or certainly people that advocated for genocide that they find it's quite acceptable. So there it is there, this guy who advocated genocide against the Scots. And I think Richard Leonard has got to answer questions about why the Manchester Labour Party are putting up the 19th century Prussian writer, philosopher and social scientist, has strong links with Manchester. So there he is. He's German, I think, obviously being Prussian. So he's not obviously from actually Celtic and from the UK. And really cancerous ideas that have blighted politics throughout Europe and really led to the deaths of tens of thousands, millions of people, hundreds of millions of people throughout the world, whether it be from China, anywhere that the ideals of Marx and Engels have been implemented, has led to genocide, which is certainly what Friedrich Engels advocated. So it's really cancer politics that he actually advocated. So I'm going to just go into something that's already on YouTube, and I'll make a commentary with regards to what this says. Now, this says, obviously, Karl Marx, racist and the ancestor to modern genocide. And if you think about intersectional politics, in Edinburgh Uni, just recently, and this must have been sanctioned by Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, that they have told white people can't speak at a lecture. Now, that's openly racist. I don't think they would have it if it was black people couldn't speak or any other minority. So this is just reverse racism against white people. But the left, whether it be intersectional politics based on Marxism or National Socialism, which is also on the authoritarian left of the political spectrum, on the political compass, that both of these are basically racist ideas, but they're both on the left. People mistake that National Socialism is a right-wing ideology. It's relative to where you would stand or be placed on the political compass, whether it's left or right. However, just looking at the political compass from above, it's in the authoritarian left. This sort of thought that racism and racial politics was from the right, and certainly not National Socialism or communism or even the Nazbols, National Bolshevism, was all three were in the authoritarian left of the political compass. And we're just going to have a wee insight into what Friedrich Engels, it says Karl Marx, the racist and the ancestor of modern genocide, but it was actually Friedrich Engels who was the espouser of genocide, but he was published in Marx's journal Neue Rheinische Zeitung, I spoke to George Galloway recently, and he had asked where the publication was. So the publication, or where Friedrich Engels wrote, was in Marx's publication called Neue Zeitung. And really, this is the predecessor to the National Socialist genocide in the 20th century. Obviously, this coming from the 19th century. So let's just have a wee look at what they're actually saying on this. I find this fascinating. The new man was obviously the new working class, also taken up in National Socialism as well. And this was written about in various publications. Marx had numerous books which were going over on political science. We started with the Jewish question. That's the first one we're analysing on political science. So the similarities between National Socialism and communism, they are quite stark. I mean, it looks like it's obviously been based, National Socialism and Adolf Hitler's understanding. We'll be doing a preview of Mein Kampf to see the similarities between that and what is being taught by Marx. Obviously, it was about, well, just under a century later that Hitler, it was probably about, Marx wrote the Jewish question 1842, I think, and Hitler's Mein Kampf was, I think, when he was in jail, when he came back from the First World War in the 20s or 30s. 20s it must have been. 1920s.
National Socialism was also about creating a new man.
In both systems, we have an ideology which has the ambition of creating a new man. That means that both systems don't agree with human nature as it is. They are in.
So this is the changing or hybridizing of a specific type of people. Natural selection taken to almost the breeding of dogs or cattle or horses to produce a new entity, a new specimen of man.
At war with nature, with human nature. This is the root.
And again, it comes into eugenics as well. They've been able to get rid of people who you deem not to be of a high enough quality. That's where the eugenics side of it came in. So it's actually the breeding of people, not based on their own preferences. This is them actually picking the best examples and hybridizing the actual ethnic group, which would have been Germanic at the time, or Russian, where the Lenin came to power.
You find it both in the Nazi. Nazi, it's an ideology based on false biology, and communism is based on false sociology. But both systems have an ambition of being scientific and resting on a scientific basis.
The main scientist of Nazism, Alfred Rosenberg, confessed to the Nuremberg Tribunal that Hitler had misused the idea of National Socialism. Indeed, the idea in the
And if you actually understand that Friedrich Engels wrote about genocide, it's not the nationalist part that actually was probably is more likely to be the basis for the genocide of the Jews, the gypsies and the socialists and other entities. It was actually the socialist part, because as we'll find out in a minute, that it was Friedrich Engels that advocated genocide. It wasn't nationalists that advocated genocide. I don't think we'll find any nationalist teachings on genocide. And this has been researched by the professor that's just about to come on.
Nazi view wasn't so bad after all. Healthy, beautiful, blonde, and happy people. A future society. And without handicapped or Jews. Nearly a paradise.
So the eugenics coming into the hybridization of the Germans to take out handicapped people, to eliminate handicapped people, to eliminate non-Germans, and it would become very much like a breeding program to hybridize the race, just as, or they call it the race, but obviously it was the Germanic ethnic people who they were trying to almost breed like racehorses or dogs, or by in taking out natural selection where the choice will be between the people, to actually selection by more than likely the state. So it was very much an authoritarian aspect where the people who were being hybridized wouldn't have had any choice.
For some reason, National Socialism did not work out, just as the Soviet Socialism didn't.
So both National Socialism and socialism have failed. And there's Bernie Sanders trying to advance socialism again. There's not much talked about the Jewish involvement in socialism, and predating National Socialism, there was a large involvement of Jewish people involved. And I think I've been told, and I haven't gone into much research, there is, within the Jewish sort of religion, there is underpinnings of socialism and Marxism. And obviously Marx being a Jew, from a Jewish lineage himself. But the involvement in the extermination in Eastern Europe, it was influenced by Jewish involvement. And that obviously predated the rise of National Socialism. So there was already extermination or involvement of Jews in the extermination of European people through communism. It wasn't just Jews, but there was, and by a minority of Jews, in the extermination of people in Eastern Europe, European people in Eastern Europe, prior to the rise of National Socialism in Germany.
Both left thousands of mass graves, millions of murdered people. Was it coincidence?
I don't think many people know that only socialists publicly advocated genocide.
Only socialists publicly advocated genocide, and what he's talking about is Friedrich Engels. Yet the Manchester Labour Party have put up a statue to Friedrich Engels, who advocated genocide, and then they've got the cheek to talk about hate speech. I mean, it's quite incredible. It's unbelievable that the Manchester Labour Party are putting statues to... Not only did they advocate genocide against the Scots, that's maybe why the Labour Party are basically being decimated in Scotland just now, because people understand that the Labour Party have put up this statue. But he was also responsible for the deaths of 100 million people in socialist countries throughout the world, whether it be China, the USSR, the starvation of Ukrainians, where I was in a film called Mr. Jones, and that showed this guy Jones, who went and actually, this reporter who went and found out about the extermination camps.
In the 19th, 20th centuries, I guess it's a very little known fact, and
So this is what's being pushed in our universities, Marxism through intersectional politics. The intersectional politics comes from the Frankfurt School, and we'll go on to talk about the Frankfurt School on the back of what was actually taught, and where the underlying ideology is from Marx and Engels, but the Frankfurt School redefined it.
First appeared in January 1849 in Marx's journal Neue Rheinische Zeitung. Engels wrote of how the class war in Marxian terms means that when socialist revolution happens, the class war happens, there will be primitive societies in Europe 2 stages behind, because they're not even capitalist yet. And he had in mind the Basques and the Bretons and the Scottish Highlanders.
So basically, Engels advocated genocide against the Basques, the Bretons, the Celtic countries, the original inhabitants of the British Isles. Obviously, Engels being a German, not like the Germans to want to murder people and kill people. I mean, Engels, England, we know that the Angles come, and that's what southern Britain is called now, obviously, about the invasion by the Germanic tribes. But I mean, obviously, southern Britain was Celtic at one point prior to the Germans coming. And the Engels is now wanting to advocate for genocide against the people who were originally here, saying they're primitive. Although they had complex societies that were just different from this totalitarian socialist entity, which eventually bred into National Socialism.
And the Serbs, and he calls them racial trash.
Racial trash. I mean, obviously, being Germanic, I mean, you can see the what's actually happened through these sort of teachings, and how the cancer has spread throughout our universities into this intersectionality, which I'll get into in a minute. Racial trash. So he was a racist. He believed, and this is where we're seeing racist teachings being acceptable as long as it's discriminating against white people and predominantly white men. That it's acceptable in our universities now. And now in a BBC, it's okay if you discriminate against white people, even in the BBC now. So the cancerous input of Marxist principles into our universities and into our academia, into our political class, including Nicola Sturgeon, is very much where this is all coming from.
Destroyed because being 2 stages behind in the historical struggle, it will be impossible to bring them up to the point of being revolutionary.
He spoke about the vulgarity and dirtiness of Slavic people, you see.
So the Slavs were called the Slavs because of the invasions of the Turks and the end of the Byzantine Empire, that they were starting to be colonised by the Turks, who had colonised Constantinople in Turkey, which was Byzantium, murdering all the Christians, kicking out Greeks from all the parts in Turkey, which was at Byzantine at the time, and killing them all in the name of Islam, the Armenian genocide by the Young Turks. And this is where this all came from.
And he thinks, for instance, that Poland has no reason to exist.
So did Hitler, and so did the USSR. Don't forget the Warsaw Pact and dividing up Hitler between National Socialism and communism.
The races, too weak to master the new conditions of life, must give way. They must perish in the revolutionary Holocaust.
Marx's People's Paper, April 16, 1851, Journal of History of Ideas. So he's talking about a revolutionary Holocaust as well. And we've seen that's what happened in practice. You only have to look at where socialist stroke communist regimes have happened, and we always see the same pattern being repeated, people being murdered because of their ideas.
Karl Marx.
Marx began it. He was the ancestor of modern political genocide. And I don't know that any...
He was the ancestor of modern political genocide, the predecessor to communism or socialism stroke communism and National Socialism and fascism. Bearing in mind that Mussolini, Giovanni Gentile, who was obviously Marx's predecessor, it wasn't Marx's predecessor. He was Mussolini's same philosopher, just the same as Marx was for socialism, and also even Mosley, all came out of the socialist left. They were all socialists before they became fascists.
Thinker of the modern period before Marx and Engels ever publicly advocated racial extermination. I can't find anything earlier, so I presume it starts with them.
The teachings of Marx and Engels were carefully studied by Lenin, the man who established the first Marxist country on earth. 1 year after Lenin's death in 1924, the New York Times published a small article, which at the time went almost unnoticed. It was about some newly established party in Germany, the National Socialist Labour Party, of which Adolf Hitler is patron and father.
The National Socialist Labour Party, and let me just go back here because I was, let's just go back here.
Published a small
New York Times.
which at the
So this
time
was published in the
almost
New York
unnoticed.
Times.
It was about some newly established party in
A new
Germany,
party in Germany.
the National Socialist Labour Party, of which Adolf Hitler is patron and father, persists in believing that Lenin and Hitler can be compared.
So Lenin and Hitler can be compared. I mean, the National Socialist Hitler and the National Socialist movement already knew that they were socialist. They had already based a lot of their ideology in what a reinterpretation of communism to fit into a more nationalist doctrine. But it was the underlying socialism that had led to the genocides, not the nationalism.
Who's speaking? A certain Dr. Goebbels.
Dr. Goebbels, the Minister for Propaganda. So he was in New York discussing this new political party in Germany, and obviously he got a lot of support to start off with internationally.
On the speaker's assertion that Lenin was the greatest man, second only to Hitler, and that the difference between communism and the Hitler faith was very slight.
The difference between communism and the Hitler faith was very slight, which is correct. A lot of people and a lot of historians have muddied the water in saying that National Socialism is right wing. It's in the authoritarian left of the political compass. It is, without a shadow of a doubt, coming out of communism. And it's a reinterpretation. It's not the same as communism. It's a reinterpretation. It's slightly more to the right, but in the authoritarian left of the political compass. And just like intersectionality, just as racist and putting people in boxes based on their immutable characteristics, whether it be feminine, whether they're women or LGBT or an ethnic minority. It's about putting people in a collective, just the same way that Hitler did as well.
A faction war opened with whizzing beer glasses. Amazing. The future Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels was openly declaring that the difference between Lenin's communism and the Hitler faith was very slight. As we read, it didn't go down well with ideas quietly disappeared. They never again publicly
Look how similar they are to the communist posters. It's quite incredible.
stressed their resemblance to communists.
Oh my goodness, look at that. That's a Nazi badge with the hammer and sickle on it, with the communist emblems of the hammer and sickle on the red flag. I mean, it's quite incredible. They're actually advertising the fact that they are underlying socialists.
In the inner circle, however, the Nazis and Hitler were more outspoken.
Hitler often said that he had learnt a great deal from Marxism, from reading Marx. I mean, the whole of National Socialism is based upon it, he said, meaning doctrinally based.
Which makes sense if you consider the fact that the genocides that Marx, I mean, the body count is higher under Marxism than it is under National Socialism. But if you consider that both are similar ideologies on the authoritarian left, both racist in their undertones, just different interpretations, that National Socialism body count should be added to the Marxism body count and the Engels, in Marx and Engels body count, who advocated for genocide.
People keep forgetting that Nazi regime in Germany was also socialist. It was, they officially were called National Socialist Workers' Party. So it's a branch of socialism. The Soviets were international socialists, and those were in Germany national socialists. So it's the same thing in reality, only slightly different interpretation.
It's incredible how similar they are. Incredible how similar these two posters are. Really just different sort of logos on it. That's why people think Antifa are a fascist organisation, although Antifa are probably in the libertarian left, but they are still extreme leftists. It's incredible, all the pictures, but how similar they are. Just different takes on the same image. Wow, look at that, that's incredible. On the right one is the Russian hands up, so similar to the left National Socialist one. Right, let's stop that there. And we're going to go straight on to intersectionality and cultural Marxism. That's what we should put in, cultural Marxism. So here we go, Dr. Jordan B. Cooper. So let's actually have a wee listen to Dr. Cooper.
Is your joint pain and arthritis even worse when it's cold or damp outside? Leaving you feeling stiff? The term cultural Marxism is one that is used heavily in modern discussions dealing with contemporary social issues as well as issues within the church. So today in our video we're going to be explaining exactly what cultural Marxism is and what the roots of it are, as well as how we are to evaluate and understand this movement. So to begin, we must look at the foundations of what Marxism is, and then discuss how it was appropriated today into what is sometimes known as cultural Marxism. Marxism begins in the 19th century with a man named Karl Marx, of course, with Friedrich Engels. Now, Marx and Engels argued that both sociology and anthropology can best be understood by gaining an understanding of class systems. Now, what they argued is that there is an essential economic divide that happens within capitalism. And people are basically divided into two groups. There is the bourgeois and the proletariat. Now, the bourgeois are those who have the most money and they control the means of production. The proletariat are the ones who are abused or used by the bourgeois and do not really have a say in what happens within a culture. And it is argued that there is then this class struggle, the ruling class as well as those who
So the actual bourgeois can use Marxism to undermine the proletariat, because obviously Marxism doesn't work because it's bad ideas. The ideas have not been properly digested and critiqued. These ideas have just been accepted. The difficulty you have with the proletariat is in access to start-up capital. Now, that can be changed just through a change in legislation and being able to, for individuals from the proletariat to be able to move into the bourgeoisie and for the bourgeoisie to become more fluent.
Or poor, the working class. And this struggle for Marx outlines the basic structure and foundations of society. And for him, all of the other inequalities and issues that happen can essentially boil down to these economic ones. Now, Marx also was a follower of Hegel, a prominent philosopher in the 19th century, who argued that history is in a process of change, and that history is essentially improving. Now, Marx bought into certain aspects of Hegel's philosophy while he rejected others. And so he created his own view of world history, that things were coming to a kind of conclusion, that things were going to improve. There was a kind of synthesis that was going to happen between the antithesis and this thesis, as Hegel described. For Marx.
And that's happening more under capitalism, because capitalism is fluid. If people have good ideas, then they rise to the top. But then it goes into corporatism rather than capitalism, where the corporatists try and protect their wealth, which is understandable, but by preventing other people rising. And that's where corporatism rather than capitalism becomes a problem. So you have to then bring in legislation to prevent corporatism.
This would lead to a new form of state that we now know as communism. Marx argued that it was inevitable within the progress of history that there would be a socialist revolution. Of course, we have seen how that worked itself out with various communist countries coming into power in the 20th century. And as we have seen, the results were not all that positive.
I think that's an understatement. I mean, we've got 100 million dead under Marxism, so it didn't work. And the economic systems failed. They didn't even get it into what Marx and Engels would have identified as a communist system. They were still trying to get into a Marxian system, a socialist system, and that didn't work. So we've got a complete failure of socialism and the development of socialism. So not that it didn't work, it was an absolute disaster, and has been a disaster in every place that it's actually been tried. The socialist then has to revert to increased educational standards or improved health standard, which is fair enough. I don't think anybody's objecting to that. But it's not about economic growth or growth of the individual, or there's a number of other factors other than just being able to read or having a good medical system. Some people don't need to use a medical system, and some people, we can now actually pretty much self-teach with the amount of information that's available through the internet. So these things are becoming less and less, and because of the onus on those in a socialist country, growth rates and improvement of the individual then becomes secondary. And then it becomes the politics of envy. Socialists don't like people to get on, which is why Bernie Sanders keeps waffling on, even though he's a millionaire, a socialist millionaire himself. He's quite happy for him to be a millionaire, but now he's waffling on about billionaires.
Describes only Karl Marx himself in a very basic overview and probably inadequate one. But after this, the ideas of Karl Marx shifted and changed, and certain thinkers took his ideas about economics and applied them to other areas of social life. In particular, this was adopted by a school of thought sometimes described as the Frankfurt School, being named after Frankfurt, Germany, where the school was founded.
So a lot of the intersectionality has come out of the reinterpretation of Marx through the German Frankfurt School. If Germany hasn't done enough already in the 20th century, they've now infested. So it came out like a poison out of Germany, like everything fountains out of Germany, this intersectionality, and fits in with the corporatist globalist agenda, which is open borders and the destruction of the nation state, so that people just become a bit like the Matrix and batteries, not for energy and as in the Matrix, but for as consumers. And it'll just be a consumer culture which will be based around the corporatist agenda, which is different from the capitalist agenda.
Now, this term, the Frankfurt School, refers primarily to an institution called the Institute for Social Research, founded in 1923 by a number of different thinkers.
I would suspect a lot of these we were Jewish thinkers, if I can remember correctly. We might go on to actually look at more depth about the Frankfurt School in a minute, but I'm sure these were Jewish thinkers.
And this is labeled critical theory. Now, critical theory itself is something that is very hard to define, and when you read the actual books on critical theory, even the authors themselves don't really give a clear definition because it really cannot be defined. But broadly speaking, critical theory is a theory of, supposedly, of all of reality, or at least that is the intention, which is critical. Critical, not just of
Shalom,
but also critical.
So again, National Socialism was a reversion of a lot of Jewish influence in the country, which sort of subverted, was subversive to the underlying interests of the domestic population.
Of historic Western thought and the historic Western world. And so critical theory plays itself out in all different areas of thought, including economics, but goes far beyond that to social relations, as well as things like art. But what's really important about this...
So that's coming into postmodernism, the postmodernist architecture, postmodernist art, which is all disgusting. It's all really horrible. It's been a blight on the post-war communities, from the architecture to the artwork, and we've seen that the SNP have managed to burn down the beautiful Glasgow Art School twice. I don't know what sort of condition it's going to be in now, and we've seen the everything that's postmodernist getting pulled down all over Glasgow that was put up post-war by the cultural Marxists.
Us today is this: that with critical theory, the ideas of Karl Marx were developed and expanded to relate to all different areas of thought.
Yeah, and just cancer, absolute ideological, political cancer.
Now, while Marx thought that all different social relations were essentially and foundationally based upon economics, critical theory began applying this narrative of an oppressed group and an oppressor group, and applying it to various aspects of social life.
So oppressed group, so it's right out of Marxism. It says here, so everybody's oppressed. So Nicola Sturgeon, who I think is an intersectional feminist, and we'll try and find out out the horse's mouth, thinks that even though she's First Minister of Scotland and maybe an alleged lesbian, that she would be oppressed as a female and oppressed as a member of the LGBT community, and that she would fit in to the oppression Olympics that this has come out of Marxism, which Marxism has now killed 100 million people. Even though she's the First Minister of Scotland, she would still be oppressed. She would be more oppressed than somebody, a white Scottish male who was going and having to eat out of soup kitchens or being on the street because of this cancerous idea.
Oppressor was no longer seen as just the rich or the bourgeois.
So this is right out. This is an expansion of the Jewish question, that the Jews were oppressed, even though that some of them were leading the banks and they were living very much the high life. This is the expansion of the Jewish question into other sections of society, and this is the tearing down of the Western culture. I think this gentleman's Jewish as well.
Production, but it was expanded to speak about issues of race, class, and gender. Classically, those are the three that are used the most, though there are many other categories.
There's no such thing as race, it's the human race. So this is race-based politics. This is just racism that has come out of the Frankfurt School of Marxism, because we've just seen that Marx and Engels were racists. So, and then that followed into National Socialism, another race-based ideology, when there's only the human race, but then there's departmentalising the actual people into collectives, so the collectives then can be controlled. It's quite disgusting.
Can be discussed in this way as well. And it's argued that there are those classes which are oppressors. Those people who are oppressors are those who are of the privileged class.
So the white males, basically white males, and white females as well, but white males, but a woman could then fit in. So Nicola Sturgeon could fit into two oppressed groups, even though she's in charge of the UK. The Duchess of Sussex could fit into at least two classes, because she's a woman of colour and a woman, that she can then fit into two oppressed classes based on Marxism, even though she has now become the Duchess of Sussex, and then pontificate this cancerous ideology on the rest of us, while some people who are going maybe white and male are the oppressor, even though that they're having to get food banks or go to food banks to actually eat. They've become the oppressor based on characteristics that they might not even be have any sort of political power. I mean, it's cancerous, this ideology.
Race, as well as the privileged gender, and the oppressed are those who are the underprivileged. And this broader narrative is seen as a way to understand basically all of reality itself, and that's the way that this developed in the culture that we are in today.
And this is where so you've got this cancerous ideology, and on the back of this, wanting open borders. So there's a lot of Jewish people involved in the open border movement. We've seen Soros, obviously from a Jewish lineage, backing Merkel, who is sending German NGOs down to Greece just now to get more immigrants in from Turkey, who are sending them across. Angela Merkel's German NGOs are down there already, and there's now open borders marches in Germany just now, and we've seen the rise of the AfD. These probably marches are being orchestrated by Merkel and other individuals now, the Islamists, who are now in bed with being manipulated just like the socialists, the Marxists. So you've now got a racist ideology against white British people while having open borders and importing this under this cultural Marxism. It's absolutely unbelievable. But through the corporatist globalist agenda, moves towards a one world government, open borders, no countries, while pushing you're all oppressed nonsense by Marx, who murdered 100 million people.
This was adopted in some ways by Foucault and postmodernism. However, postmodernism actually denies the essential idea of any overarching meta-narrative at all, and that would include the Marxist meta-narrative. So certain ideas from Marxism, or what is sometimes known now as cultural Marxism, were adopted by postmodernists, though they do not necessarily have the kind of optimism of social revolution as a necessity, as Karl Marx himself did. Though oftentimes I think it's the case that activists really don't know about the consistency of these various positions with one another. And so in our current societal discourse, when you hear people talking about an oppressed class and an oppressor, and making arguments for certain laws or ideas that necessitate that the oppressor becomes less privileged so that the oppressed can gain some kind of benefit in society. That essentially...
So what they want is favouritism, one law for one and one for another. And that people, because they're part of a greater group, have privilege. I mean, it's only the privileged that have privilege. It's not the people who are in the group. And some people who are in a minority class may be doing better than people out in the what is the oppressor class. So it then becomes one law for one, one for another. And this can be facilitated by people in who may be seen as the elite or the political elite or in the oppressive class. They then start to penalise people who are not having any privilege within, because they're within that class group that they say that is oppressing the individual, while at the same time bringing in people to displace them through the open borders policy. They're allowed to discriminate against what would be white people and white males, that this is acceptable and this is not racism because you can't, because they're the oppressor, which comes right out of this nonsense from Marxism. It's all cancerous ideas.
Is what we know as cultural Marxism. So what do we do with this idea? What do we think about cultural Marxism? Is this a good thing for society or is it a bad thing for society? Well, in some sense, the basic ideas of cultural Marxism can only come from a Christian worldview and a Christian perspective. Now, that might seem rather odd, and why would I say that? Karl Marx himself was quite critical of Christianity, as were the Frankfurt School.
Well, I mean, Christianity is obviously another Jewish concept as well. Obviously, the Torah was the Jewish question, the Jewish Bible, and then obviously the Bible, and then obviously the continuation into another Abrahamic religion such as Islam, which is deeply anti-Semitic, probably more anti-Semitic than Mein Kampf. So this is all based around very much Jewish concepts.
A pre-Christian world in the West, there wasn't really any kind of status for victims or the oppressed.
So I mean, obviously, it's all about the oppression Olympics and Jewish people being oppressed, and the way Jewish people were oppressed, especially when the Romans came and conquered them, and then they were conquered again by a number of different things, and then they were kicked out of their own country.
Greek literature, you'll see that there really wasn't a care for the oppressed at all. That's not to say that nobody cared for oppressed groups, but there was no broader understanding in terms of societal structure or morality that would give the victim class any kind of status whatsoever. These values really came through
the victim class. See, the victim class, you may be of an ethnic minority or a certain religion and you've never been victimised. This might not be applicable. You actually might be privileged in certain things. Now you've got double privilege because you have this alleged victimisation, which may not even be happening.
Back to the Old Testament, we see books like the prophet Amos speaking about those who are victims or those who are oppressed and the need and the importance of taking care of those who are victimized and oppressed. And this becomes a value that is very important for the Christian West. And it's something that people care about in the Christian West and should continue to care about. However, what cultural Marxism has done is taken this Christian foundation and then manipulated it and distorted it. While Christians should certainly be caring and considerate of those who are victims, those who are oppressed.
Not being a Christian, this is probably not applicable to me either.
We have an understanding that all people are made in the image of God, whatever their sex, race, class might be. This does not mean that persons themselves must be judged by whatever class they are essentially a part of. For Christianity, this is not some overarching narrative that we can place everybody into one of these categories of either oppressor or oppressed. And this is exactly what you find in modern Marxist and postmodern theory. The interesting thing about this, of course, is now the Christians have become, in the minds of some at least, the oppressive class and therefore on the wrong side. So here now are some of the problems with this Marxist theory. First, it is problematic when people are treated first and foremost by whatever particular group that they are a part of, rather than as the individuals that they are. Now, have an identity in our groups and communities as well as we do individually, but these group identities do not define absolutely everything about us. And this leads to the second problem, which is that a lot of these groupings are really arbitrary. Why is it, for example, that every white person is classified in a particular group because of race, when those white people may be of extremely different economic statuses, from very different parts of the world, and have completely different life experiences, when there's really nothing that unites them at all other than the fact that they have the same skin color.
Because it's a racist, race-based ideology based on racism, which is why at Edinburgh University they're able to now discriminate against white people in their own country, and this reverse racism is allowed to continue like a cancer by the SNP in Scotland without any punitive measures.
I lump people into groups in this way. And there are so many aspects of reality that determine what one's privilege is, and that doesn't just have to do with whether it might be a skin color or gender or race. It could be one's attractiveness. It could be one's athletic ability. It could be one's ability to speak with people. Or it could be, one's disabilities, which is why people are now talking about being disabled as another kind of underprivileged group, as well as able-bodied people having privilege. The point is that this list could go on and on and on. There are so many different factors that determine what somebody's privilege and underprivilege might be that you really can't simply classify it in any way at all. A third problem is that this can actually lead to exactly the same power dynamic that these people are pushing against. It is the case that those who are considered to be underprivileged and are fighting against those of privilege, that they then use their own class as a way of gaining an upper hand against those who are considered to be in the privileged class. And isn't this really just the same kind of power dynamic they're accusing others of, and now they're using this narrative as a way to put themselves into power? And the final problem is that those with this particular idea seem to think that society is always in this growth or progress, that things are constantly getting better. Society is getting better, and government can and should have more power to be able to enforce these kinds of equality. But in reality, we know that the world is not necessarily getting better. In some ways it is, of course, in terms of technology and healthcare and many other advances in human life. But as Christians, I confess that sin is just a part of reality. It's a part of nature. This is why Marxists are generally opposed to Christianity. A view that says that man is inherently sinful does not really work with an idea that the government must enforce this kind of equality, because we must confess that...
So it must enforce this form of equality. So this is very much being forced upon the populace. And if you actually think about the Conservative Party in the UK is starting to adhere to Marxist principles, which is very disturbing. I mean, it's like a fake Conservative Party that they're actually adhering to the God of diversity, open borders, and enforcing these types of Marxian principles.
And that we should care for victims and those who are abused and victimized in various different ways. We can't force that to change. We can't force that to stop. Now, as individuals, we can certainly and should help those who are in need in whatever ways that we can. And we can talk and disagree and debate about various government policies. But the notion that we can bring about some kind of utopian, total egalitarian state is simply false. Well, I know that this is a short video and these ideas are probably inadequately explained because there's not enough time to get...
No, I thought that was quite well explained. Origins of the Frankfurt School. Let's go on here.
Wat is er gebeurd bij 68, waar ik zelf toe behoor tot die generatie. Ik ben oud genoeg om te weten waarover het gaat. Ik heb ook...
It's about how experienced things in the 1968, 69 and later. And back then I saw that how 68 works, but at the moment you are young, 18, 19, and you don't realise what's happening. You are still at a superficial... So the entire ideology was crystallised later by Michael Foucault Giles Deleuze, Jacques Derrida, and these types of people. I'm going to come out of that, as fascinating as it is.
The critical theory of the Frankfurt School ought to be understood as a continuation of the long tradition of Jewish antinomianism, as it emphasizes a break from the ideology and norms of the existing modern order for the sake of redemption. The members of the Frankfurt School drew inspiration from the Western canonical tradition with its blend of Jewish and pagan precepts, rather than seeking to destroy it. Their animosity towards Western industrial capitalist society and the progress myth grew out of the historical disdainful attitudes of the Goyim towards European Jewry, culminating in a genocide characterized by hierarchical obedience and technical efficacy.
Well, obviously, as I mentioned earlier on, the significance of the Jewish involvement in socialism and the rise of socialism and Marxian principles in Russia under Lenin, who was part Jewish as well, where the Holocaust and Stalin eventually led to the deaths of millions of people in Russia of European heritage, and now the advancement of this, the Frankfurt School, is very interesting.
Jew-hating conspiracy theorists really knew anything about Jewish history and the Frankfurt School, they'd bring up Walter Benjamin, may Hashem avenge his blood, and his admitted interest in the Gnostic, Sabbatean, Frankist heresies, something he picked up from his good friend and theologian Gershom Scholem, which consisted of a moral transcendence of Jewish law and ethics, such as the consumption of unkosher foods, ritual sodomy, feasts and orgies on Purim, etc., egalitarianism and female liberationist doctrines, all in the name of tikkun and messianic redemption. The Dunma, the loyal followers of Shabbatai Tzvi, publicly converted to Islam in the manner of the forced conversion of their Mashiach, all while secretly practicing their clandestine heretical Jewish faith, replete with wife-swapping, homosexuality, and other Abrahamic no-nos.
Well, that's very interesting. I think we'll leave that just now. I would like to find out more about what actually happened in the Jewish origins.
For the first time, Americans today are not free to say what they think. If they say something deemed offensive or insensitive or, worst of all...
So we have to consider the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party are just about to bring in legislation that if people are racist in a hospital, I don't believe in racism, but if they're racist in a hospital and it's a non-medical practice, then they won't get seen, which again is part of the Marxian school. So we've got conservatives in the UK who are bringing in Marxist principles. I mean, it's quite incredible how we are being duped that somehow that they are actually conservatives.
Hate speech. They may be...
Again, hate speech. I mean, hate speech is just in a way of actually undermining freedom of speech. So you're then not able to say things with regards to a group based on the underlying Marxist principles that we've just seen of the intersectionality out the Frankfurt School of Marxism, which killed 100 million people.
They may be punished for violating the unholy commandments of the 90s, commonly known as political correctness. But is political correctness a new phenomenon? We'll show you tonight that political correctness has been in the making for more than 8 decades. And it seems that a deteriorating society is exactly what political correctness strives for. But just what is political correctness? As you're about to see, political correctness is nothing less than a Marxist ideology. Marxism translated from economic into cultural terms in an effort going back not to the 1960s, but to World War I. Marxist theory had predicted that if war came to Europe, the working class in every European
European country would rise in revolt. But that theory proved
They would rise in revolt and then commit genocide against the Scots, the Basques, the Bretons, all the Celtic countries because they were underperforming. They weren't capitalists yet. They would just murder them from a German, Engels. The Manchester Labour Party have now put a statue up to.
when the First World War began in 1914, the workers' loyalty to their country proved stronger than their so-called class consciousness.
So nationalism, actually it was nationalism that benefited and is a bulwark against socialism that advocates genocide. But what the cultural Marxists have done is switched it, that it was the nationalism that was the problem, and then obviously corrupted the country by open borders, cultural Marxism, the destruction of the nation state, and there was the socialism by ethnically cleansing through the use of mass immigration, which Angela Merkel, obviously being an ex-member of the Communist Party in Germany, seems to be advocating for Germany. Through our open borders policy, where the NGOs backed by Soros, Jewish, down to southern Europe.
French or German, Austrian or Russian or British, and marched off by the millions to fight each other. In 1917, a Marxist revolution did occur in Russia, but it failed to spread to Western Europe, again contradicting orthodox Marxist theory. At the war's end, Marxist theorists had to confront the question, what had gone wrong? Antonio Gramsci in Italy and Georg Lukács in Hungary believed they had the answer. Gramsci and Lukács argued that Western culture had blinded the working class to its true Marxist class interests. Before a Marxist revolution could take place, Western culture had to be destroyed. In 1919, Lukács, who was considered the most brilliant...
So Bernie Sanders is looking to destroy America through the use of... he's been very vocal in his praise for authoritarian Marxist regimes, looking to destroy America, backed by AOC, who's an absolute clown. And Miss Omar, who potentially married her brother, allegedly married her brother, to commit immigration fraud. And so these are really Marxists, underlying Marxists, that are trying to subvert the USA. Obviously, the Islamists who Miss Omar or Mrs. Omar would represent are just useful idiots. But it's not. Marxism is just a tool by the corporatist globalists to destroy the nation state and to have open borders. And Marxism is just a useful tool for them.
Theorists since Marx himself asked, who will save us from Western civilization? That same year, 1919, Lukács became Deputy Commissar for Culture in the Bolshevik Bela Kun government in Hungary, where he launched a program of cultural terrorism. As part of that program, Lukács introduced a radical sex education program into the Hungarian schools.
Like we're seeing just now with transgender and LGBT lessons, where the family, and obviously we have a declining birth rate, the LGBT and transgender ideals are permeating in, and obviously the majority of LGBT people do not have children. So by promoting LGBT and basically transgenderism, where you castrate people, then expedites the decline in the population. And by putting in lessons for feminism and the liberalisation for women, then the decline, we see a decline in the family units.
Political correctness, as we know it, was already beginning to take form.
He tried to actually undermine the unity of the family, and that was one of the reasons that he tried to introduce sex education.
Laszlo Pastor, a leader in the Hungarian resistance against the communist takeover of Hungary after World War II, explains why children were targeted.
it's always much tougher to convert an adult, you know, to...
So we're getting that again through Nicola Sturgeon, the attack on children, the use of the state through public sector education, where all the education is the same, the attack on them by an extremely left-wing, intersectional feminist, potentially lesbian First Minister who has no children herself. We're now seeing an attack on them through our education system, and that our education system in Scotland is failing, getting worse under the SNP.
Do something what he was told not to do.
The program left great residual effects on Hungary.
The only thing what we were permitted to accept as far as culture is concerned, what they were teaching, that was it. Free thinking was a very big sin.
The Bela Kun government lasted only a few months, in part because the Hungarian working class was outraged by Georg Lukács's assault on traditional Western culture. But meanwhile, in Germany, a new attempt to create a Marxist critique of Western culture was taking shape.
So basically what they're trying to do continually is destroy Western culture through open borders, through programs like this, to destroy the West. That's their objective, and to build it back up in the socialist dystopia. And that's their basically objectives, is the destruction of Western values.
The wealthy young son of a millionaire grain trader, Felix Weil, wanted to establish a public policy institute, a think tank, to serve as a home for advanced Marxist thought. Modeled on the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow, Weil's think tank was originally to be named the Institute for Marxism. Martin Jay, chairman of the history department at Berkeley, an author of a history of the Frankfurt School, explains why the name was changed to the Institut für Sozialforschung.
So it all comes out the Frankfurt School. So the cancer of the Frankfurt School has permeated into the USA and other institutions, including institutions in Scotland. I don't know how it was disseminated, but that's certainly, it's been disseminated through the various institutions.
Institute for Social Research.
But I think they were very interested in trying to avoid being overly labeled. So it's a fairly bland name, the Institute for Social Research.
The institute was affiliated with Frankfurt University in Frankfurt, Germany, and in time became known simply as the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School formally opened its doors on June 22nd, 1924, but it had already held its first seminar on theory in the spring of 1923. There, almost 24 Marxist scholars gathered for what Weil, the sponsor, called a Marxist study week. One of the participants...
Quite a large Jewish influence there as well, as you can see.
Later, a famous Soviet spy. Another was Georg Lukács. Lukács's writings on culture were the basis for much of the program. Almost half of the participants in this Marxist study week would later be affiliated with the Frankfurt School. Following Lukács's lead, the Frankfurt School would be the vehicle that translated Marxism from economic into cultural terms, giving us what we now know as political correctness. The Frankfurt School's first director was an Austrian Marxist economist.
All going back to the Jewish question, and Marx writing the Jewish question, that the Jews were oppressed, regardless of their social position or the amount of money, just by dint of being Jewish, which is quite clever. If you're very rich, super rich, and then you tell people that you're oppressed, we've seen how that ended up playing out in the 20th century, but very interesting, right out of Marxism.
Greenberg's principal effort was to firmly establish the Institute's Marxist...
Obviously Jewish as well.
In his inaugural address, which opened the Institute's new building in Frankfurt, Greenberg said,
"It has been our intention here from the outset to maintain uniformity in the way we look at problems and go about solving them. I too am one of the opponents of the economic, social and legal order which has been handed down to us from history. And I too am one of..."
So they want to overturn the already values in the Western society. It's not to fit into Western society or the fact that they're there. It's for them to overturn it into whatever doctrine it is. And so what we're actually getting in Scotland and other places is one rule for one for another, which is cancerous, ideologically cancerous right from the start. Based on oppression points, not based on what's actually happened, based on just being part of a group based on Marxism.
In the new research institute, Marxism will from now on have a home.
Not the fact that 100 million people have died because of this cancerous ideology, just about a reinterpretation of the cancer. Can you imagine this was National Socialism? And obviously Marxism and Marx and Engels' ideology has killed more than National Socialism. But if you think the National Socialism and fascism come out of Marxism and the authoritarian left, that people would not actually tolerate this sort of cancer, ideological cancer, being disseminated, and again coming out of Germany as well.
On economic questions and the labor movement, conventional Marxist subjects. But in 1930, Greenberg was replaced as director by a young Marxist intellectual with very different ideas.
I think he's Jewish as well.
Max Horkheimer.
Horkheimer, oh my goodness. So, we've got very much this Jewish influence that is pervading this cancerous ideology.
And to use the Institute to develop a new Marxism, very different from the Marxism of the Soviet Union.
First, recognizing the economic success of capitalism, Horkheimer announced that revolution was unlikely to come from the working class.
So the revolution is unlikely to come from the working class. Because Marxism had been proven not to work in capitalism, if you think about the great Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, etc., they knew that Marxism was a dead duck in Europe, but they had to continually pump through the cancer of Marxism. And they knew they weren't going to get it through the working class because they saw how much more oppressed the working class was under socialism in the United States. So if you look at China just now, how the state oppresses the worker more than an individual institution, because you could leave an individual institution, you can't leave the state or an individual company.
Harvard School would have to find a substitute.
So now they've got the substitute in the oppressed groups. So females are oppressed, gay and lesbians are oppressed, and the pumping of the corporatist globalist money into these open borders, all these people are oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed, and hopefully they revolt and overturn and bring in Marxist principles on the back of that. The revolution coming from women, ethnic minorities, gay and lesbians, regardless of whether they're oppressed or not.
This was the great question. The great question is there a surrogate for the working class?
The Frankfurt School would not find an answer to this question until the 1960s. But meanwhile, Horkheimer moved to revive Lukács's work by making the culture, not the economy, the central focus of the Frankfurt School's work.
And everything that they've actually has come out has been cancer. I mean, from art, Glasgow School of Art burning down a beautiful building by Macintosh twice. They burnt it down twice, and they built this cancerous postmodernist eyesore architecture. That's all been pulled down because it's so disgusting. If you think about the Grenfell fire that killed all those people, the cladding was put over a Marxist building, a cultural Marxist building, because it was so unattractive. And then these people died because it was flammable retiling. But it was so horrible that the cladding had to be put over it. And all these, there's Sighthill in Edinburgh and Sighthill in Glasgow that have been pulled down because of the cancerous Marxism that has come out of the Frankfurt School. Architecturally, and even the artists that are coming out of Glasgow School of Art follow the postmodernist painting, and the stuff's shit.
In his history of the Frankfurt School, The Dialectical Imagination, if it can be said that in the early years of its history, the Institute concerned itself primarily with an analysis of bourgeois society's socio-economic substructure, in the years after 1930, its prime interest lay in its cultural superstructure. Indeed, the traditional Marxist formula regarding the relationship between the two was called into question.
The key to the Frankfurt School's work on culture was the crossing of Marx with Freud. Just as classical economic Marxism argued that under capitalism, the working class was oppressed, so the Frankfurt School used Freud to argue that under Western culture, everyone lived in a constant state of psychological repression.
So there were radical Freudians during this period who had hopes of using psychoanalysis to end what Reich called sexual alienation, which they saw as significant as economic alienation.
So, again, sexual alienation about the LGBT. So, either everybody would have to be open to have promiscuous sex with everybody else, so that you wouldn't have people who are solid on their sexual preference. You would have to have open sexuality, that you are prepared to go with people who you may not be sexually attracted to, whether lesbians go with heterosexual men or LGBT, transgender people go with lesbians, men to women with penises go with lesbians. This is all coming out of this sexual revolution. But a lot of these people don't want to do that because obviously it goes against how they feel.
The solution, according to the Frankfurt School, was not just a political revolution to overthrow capitalism, but a social and cultural revolution as well.
So these people are subversive. These people are trying to overthrow our country. So these are not good actors. These people are deliberately trying to overturn our countries and our ways of life.
Institute's work on cultural issues, Horkheimer brought in some new blood.
As you can see, terrible music as well. Everything's bad. Their culture, their architecture, everything's horrible. Looks terrible, and from the beauty of the architecture, postmodernist, pre-modernist, and then postmodernist, the absolutely disgusting stuff, disgusting architecture, disgusting, everything's disgusting, the debasing of culture, it's all just disgusting.
A music critic, Theodore Adorno,
Disgusting music.
sees this edition as critical.
Well, Adorno was perhaps the most fecund and I think brilliant of all the members of the Frankfurt School.
Another new member was Erich Fromm. Fromm, a practicing psychoanalyst, was noted for his radical Marxist social psychology. He pioneered the concept of sexual liberation and gender politics.
So again, destroying sexual liberation to destroy the family unit, which is successfully done. We've got declining birth rates in the West. Sexual liberation for women, which may well be good for certain women, but in other cases we are seeing the destruction of the family unit, because obviously commitment in the family unit goes encounters the sexual liberation.
Fromm's view, masculinity and femininity were not reflections of essential sexual differences. They were derived instead from differences in life functions, which were in part socially determined.
Another piece of political correctness was falling into place.
In 1932, Herbert Marcuse became a member of the Institute for Social Research. Marcuse would ultimately become the most important member of the Frankfurt School for the development of political correctness. In the 1950s and 60s, Marcuse would complete the translation of Marxism into cultural terms and inject it into the New Left. Martin J. sums it up.
And this is progressivism or wokeness. These are just terms for the Frankfurt School. This is just the same. We should just start calling it Marxist, because they are Marxists. And obviously, we just have to keep reminding them that they killed 100 million people.
The United States represented the most radical inclinations of the school, in a sense continuing the work they'd done in the 1920s and into the 30s, a work that was inspired by Marxist Hegelian philosophy. We're interested in the crisis both of capitalism and liberal democracy, trying to find alternatives to the working class.
As we've seen, the Frankfurt School, Marxist in origin, wanted to create a cultural revolution against Western society.
in the 1930s, they took...
So these are subversives. These aren't people that are trying to help our country. These are people who are subverting our culture. So these people should need to be called out for what they're actually trying to do.
First step. In the 1930s, the work of Horkheimer, Adorno, Fromm, and Marcuse issued its first tangible product, critical theory. The term critical theory is something of a play on words. One is tempted to ask, what is the theory? The answer is, the theory is to criticize. Through unremitting, destructive criticism of every institution of Western society, they hope to bring...
But what we're finding is that the Marxists don't like to be criticised or analysed or even answer questions. They now get the police to stop people actually answering questions.
Society down. Critical theory is the basis for gay studies, black studies, women's studies, and various others.
Oh, race and misandrous and these should be stopped in the universities. This is just absolute racism and the promotion of racism, whether it be white or if it was white racism, you should call that out. And these are deliberately racist and sexist for women to become sexist, and that to be acceptable because obviously they're trying to bring in you can't be racist if you're to white people or to white men or to white heterosexual men, because obviously this Marxism is for the undermining of Western culture. Why it's being accepted by the Conservative Party in the UK and the Conservative Party in America, that Marxist principles are being implemented, it's only because I think that there's an underlying corporatists who and Islamists and there are other things outside Europe who are trying to undermine and being helped by people that are in our political institutions now. From the Conservatives, not from the left, from the Conservatives. It's only the Conservatives and people who are saying that they're Conservatives have the power to implement these. These can be stopped by the Conservatives.
University campuses today.
And are not.
Are the home base of political correctness. David Horowitz was present at the birth of campus political correctness.
Well, I was a radical in the 60s. I was a Marxist.
Yeah, I'm not saying that these are all Jews, but I mean you can see that there's a Jewish undertone to all of this Marxism, and that obviously none of them are responsible. I remember seeing in YouTube that there was a Jewish professor, and I don't think he was sacked, who was talking about the genocide of white people. White Americans, and I don't think he was sacked for it. I mean, that's to me inciting genocide, and he should have been put in prison. We've already seen that the Marxists have killed 100 million people.
My buddies were people like Tom Hayden. I edited.
If this guy was a Nazi, think if this guy was a Nazi, would what he's saying be acceptable, and would you be able to set up Nazi departments, Nazi departments in the universities throughout America and Europe? And why have they been allowed to ferment, and why haven't they been closed down?
Magazine of the left at the time, Ramparts. But the Frankfurt School was important in Marxism because they no longer believed really in the future. They only believed in destroying capitalism.
They only believe in destroying the capitalism that's been the most progressive and wealth generating system that's ever come out of the world. The Marxism has failed. It's actually failed, but they still want to destroy the Western civilization. These guys and these people are subversives.
Destroying bourgeois democracy is what we would have called it. And if you look at today's campuses...
So I think that, and they're not even Democrats. So they don't believe in democracy, they believe in the authoritarian left, and we've seen where that goes every time.
It's really the dominant theme. That is attack America.
The Frankfurt School.
attack freedom, attack people who have want freedom. And Bernie Sanders is the shining example of the model image of what comes out of the Frankfurt School.
What critical theory was for, only what it was against. Again, Martin Jay, the Frankfurt School's semi-official historian.
The critical theory itself always felt reluctant about being put in the straitjacket of systemization and defied its reduction to a simple definition.
Critical theory actually attempted to politicize logic itself. Horkheimer wrote, "Logic is not independent of content. That means an argument is logical if it helps destroy Western culture, illogical if it supports it. Such twisted thought lies at the heart."
That's why Antifa do not actually engage into debate, because they will lose the debate. They know all the Antifa, which is the embodiment, the armed response of the Marxists, can't debate. They don't want to debate. That's why they shut debate down and just use violence, because the critical theory and Marxism is about destruction. That's why Antifa should be made a terrorist organisation. Although they don't represent this authoritarian left wing, they would be facilitators in the authoritarian Marxism being brought in.
American university students.
When there's 1% of the campus is conservative, the other 9%, and the other 9% of people who care are incredibly liberal, you're going to get something approaching a socialist state.
Liberalism and Marxism are not the same thing. The liberalism, because the corporatist globalists have used, if you think about just now what's happening in America, and Bloomberg, who is a billionaire, is in the same party and is a corporatist globalist, part of the corporatist globalist cabal, like Soros. All of these are the super rich. And they're in the same party as a self-confessed Marxist. So the super rich, the corporatist globalists, the ones that are moving for a one world government, are in the same party as those who are shouting about oppression and the Islamists. So the Islamists, the Marxists and the corporatist globalists are in the one democratic party. So you can see the correlation of the destruction of Western culture. But it's actually the corporatist globalists, obviously the people with the money, and that's why Bernie Sanders won't get elected as the democratic choice. It will be a corporatist globalist to make sure that the power balance is preserved, and that's why a lot of Bernie supporters will probably be voting for Trump.